This is the Peace and Justice Review, dedicated to shedding light on important issues involving the environment, human rights, economic and social justice, and struggles for peace around the world. This program hopes to inspire dialogue and action for social change in Vermont and in our country. We encourage you to find out more by calling the Peace and Justice Center at 863-2345 or stop by and visit our extensive library at 21 Church Street in Burlington.
Hi, this is John Tucker of the Peace and Justice Center and the Racial Justice and Equity Project, here with Dr. Larry McCrory, Professor Emeritus from the University of Vermont, and this is our 5th show in a series. Hello, Larry.
We're getting there, John.
Yes, we are.
It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again. I believe you have some questions for me today.
Well, I like to turn the tables on you. You've been questioning me for years. And really, it occurred to me that you've been here now for a very, very, very long time. In fact, I can still remember the first day. It goes way back. But you've been here, and almost every hour, excuse me, of every one of those days, you've been involved somehow in the pursuit of social justice and working in the area of human rights and so forth. And I'd just like to get some feeling for, and I'm sure the audience would like to get some feeling for, what kind of background leads to that kind of commitment, and what fuels that kind of energy in terms of hanging in there somehow, despite the lack of progress that we all cry about.
Right. I think any number of things. I think one, as you know, you and I go back to 1979-80 when I lived up here for a very short time with my ex, and then for physical reasons and health problems, I had to retire from my career in Manhattan, New York City, and unfortunately she and I separated and became divorced, as you know, and I figured this was as safe a place as any, since my youngest daughter, who you know very well, at one time you knew her very well, was at Yale, and it was nearby. I could be close to her and you and a number of black men, as it turned out. You, Jesse Watkins, Larry Onley, Fred Matthews, all of whom I knew from when I lived up here before, were here. So it wasn't like I was moving up here alone. And like you said, I mean, it took me a year to decide to move here. I was living half here and half in New York. And Vermont being Vermont, I remember you and I, a guy named Haskell Garrett, and some other people were standing out on the corner talking, and a comment was made because the cop cars went by twice and said, well, there's 5 of us out here talking.
That's a gang.
It's a gang. And I just found myself enveloped all of a sudden. I think it started with Richard Wright, who's no longer here, Rodney Patterson, Ellen Kaler at the center. We had a big meeting, and there were meetings at Patrick Brown's restaurant.
Oh, yes.
In the summer.
Oh, yes.
And Dolores Sandoval was still here then. So there were a number of people who felt like you and I that to deal with the issues that affected black people and Afro-Americans in general, you had to be active. And there were a number of things that came up. One, we found out that the Department of Health, as you remember, had come out with a Healthy Vermonter 2000.
Oh, yes.
And there was no mention of minorities in there.
None whatsoever on those early days.
That's how this all started. Richard Wright was here, Rodney Patterson. And if you remember, you and I and Richard and Rodney did a lot of things together. The foursome ended up being a twosome.
Well, I want to get back to that, and I certainly want to ask you about the the Peace and Justice Center in general, but specifically the Racial Justice and Equity Project. But before all of that, tell me a little bit about your upbringing in Philadelphia. You and I came from the same place, Philadelphia,
Yeah.
a different era, but the same place.
Yeah.
I'm sure my experience earlier than yours was very different than yours.
And
but-
almost similar in some ways.
Okay, so what was the Philadelphia of your era?
The Philadelphia of my era was segregated.
Okay.
Like your family, my dad and mom dealt with a lot of issues that were outright segregation and not the subtle thing that goes on now. There were restaurants they couldn't go to.
That's right.
There were movies where they had to sit in the balcony of the movies or on one side of the movies. There were black theaters and white theaters. Oppression was everywhere in Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia wasn't much different than the South.
See, I would have thought in your generation that that had begun to disappear, because that's the Philadelphia that I grew up in. I guess it hadn't changed very much.
My schools, what changed, I guess, for me, my schools that I went to, which were public schools, until I was sent away to a private school in 11th grade by my dad, were usually half Jewish and half black.
Right, okay.
And anti-Semitism in Philly was as rampant as anything else.
Yes, yes, yes.
So a natural alliance formed that was political in nature. And then the American Friends were there. That was the other thing. But Philadelphia was
Yeah,
a
who
very
were-
prejudiced town.
That group, of course, was very helpful to me, as you well
Right.
know. I mean, that's how I got my job at Sharp and Dome.
Right.
But you had one thing in your life that, well, you had many things for that matter, but one, as far as I'm concerned, very special thing in your life.
That was
which-
my dad.
That's apt. You know where I'm going.
Yeah, my father was a very interesting man. My father went to Lincoln, you know, Lincoln, which is out in Oxford, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
Around the same time, Langston Hughes and Nkrumah and people like that went there. And my dad had a particular outlook on life. And one of the things I remember, and I think I told you this, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I took my brother, who was younger than me, because that's what you did when you grew up in black families. You took care of your younger brother. And usually your parents both worked. And it was a Saturday, and we went off to the movies. So my dad and mom were divorced, and my father came to see us. And we're at the movie, and we went to see Hannibal.
Okay.
All of a sudden, we're sitting up, and about a third of the movie goes by, and the lights go in the movie, and this man is just raising hell in the back of the theater. I want my children. Get up from this seat, talking to my brother and I. Hannibal did not look like Victor Mature. And he said, why your mother or anybody else would have a group of black children sitting up in the theater looking at Victor Mature playing Hannibal. He said, that's some more of that garbage coming out of Hollywood. And he said, we're not having that. And so he made us leave the movie. And I remember there was a couple of black parents there with their kids seeing the movie, and they got up and left the movie too, because they hadn't thought about it. And my dad always thought about things
Yes,
like that.
yes.
And I looked at him, and he said, Hannibal, Carthage was a country between Egypt and Ethiopia. He said, you think everybody looked like Victor Mature there? Come on, John. I mean, and the education process started at a very early age. Another time I can remember, I went to visit him on a Saturday, and he was shaving, and we were going to go visit my great-grandfather, who lived around the corner on Hafford Avenue in West Philadelphia.
Right.
And he had a private interest, so he had the upstairs apartment, and I went down. Somebody had knocked on the door, and he told me to open the door. So I go down, and an insurance man, that was in the days when the insurance man would come to
Oh,
your
yeah,
house.
every week.
Yeah. And this white man came to the door and hollered up the steps at my father, hey, boy, how you doing? And my father looked right down at him and said, leave. John, show him the door. So I was like 8 or 9. So I showed him out the door. I said, my daddy wants you to leave. And the guy turned, I remember his face turned beet red. And when we left, my father was finished shaving. We got to the top of the steps, and I said, Daddy, why did you make him leave? He said, do I look like a boy to you? Boy? He said, I'm not a boy. He said, that's another word that white men and women use to put us in our place. So he gets dressed, we walk down the steps, we go out the house, and we go around on Hafford Avenue. My great-grandfather lived next to the church that he built. And I'm in the house, and I'm talking to my great-grandfather, and I said, Pop, Daddy made me put this man out the house, and why? So my great-grandfather looks at me. He was a very proud man. And as I figured out, I mean, he had gone to the black school in Virginia. What's that one? Hampton. And then he went to Temple, to the seminary school. And he was the first black to go there. And very bright, very educated. And so he was explaining my father's position. And then my father said, Pop, we need to show him what this is all about. And my great-grandfather said, come upstairs with me. And my father looked at him and said, I think he's too young for that, Pop. He said, no. If he's old enough to ask these questions, he needs to find out the truth. And I think I was 9. It was right after my 9th birthday, come to think of it. So we go upstairs to the second floor. He goes in, takes his jacket off, because he always wore a jacket and a tie.
Right.
Took his jacket off, unloosened his tie, and took his shirt off, and turned his back to me, and on his back were thin stripes. And that's when I found out some of the history of my family. Mm-hmm. He had been born on a slave farm. His mother was the owner of the plantation was his father, and he beat him for taking extra bread. And he was 90-some years old then, and those scars were still there. Mm-hmm. So I guess this work came easy, because I was always able to make the connections.
Yeah, and you're very fortunate. I'm not sure you know how fortunate you are, because most of us did not have that kind of education. Most of us our families had, in one way or another, bought into the system. And even though they knew that kind of history, they weren't very proud of it, or at least it was not passed along. You're very fortunate to have had a father who, number one, was that strong, number two, that knowledgeable, and thirdly, was active in the sense that he didn't let that kind of stuff he didn't let anybody get away with it.
No, I mean, he didn't let anyone in the family get away with it.
That's wonderful.
I told you the story.
Right.
My father came in the house one day visiting my mother. I was 13 or 14. I guess I was 13 in 9th grade. And my mother was getting me ready for the cotillion. You know what that was in Philly.
Of course I know the cotillion. I fought it like crazy, but
and my father looked at my mother.
My mother was very upset because I wouldn't go.
My father looked at my mother. And the other thing, you know, all that color stuff was going on in our community. You know, who had good hair, all that business was going on. And my father looked at my mother and said to the what?
Right.
My mother said, he's going to go to the cotillion this year.
Right.
My father said, let me get this straight. Y'all can't ride on the front of the bus, and you don't have any rights and everything. You got the nerve to have a cotillion?
Right.
And he just was against any of that until he felt that some of the distance was being closed between segregation.
Yeah, but don't you see that if more of us had felt that way, things would have moved along a lot faster?
Well, what I learned from my grandfather, but my grandfather explained that this was just the next step along the road, because from the day, and you know, we talked about Middle Passage, from the time Middle Passage happened through slavery, a portion of black America has constantly been bringing itself, moving it forward, one step at a time.
Yep.
You and I are just the other step in, you know, This is a struggle that's been going on for 400 years.
Yeah, it's a great relay race.
Yeah.
The torch is passed, or the baton is passed from
Yeah.
one generation
I couldn't
to
have
the
done what
next.
my parents did. Could you?
I don't know.
Or your grandparents?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe, I mean, I individually, maybe not, but there are people now who could have done what they did. I mean, look at the people who sent their children to the newly integrated schools in the South. That takes as much, I think that would take as much courage as we're talking about with these older people.
And I think you're right, because I watched.
I don't know whether
I
I could
watched The
send
Survivor.
my little daughter to one of those schools.
But I
with these
watched.
horrible
I'll tell you
people.
what, though. I watched the survivors of those Little Rock kids.
Yes,
They're now
I
grown.
saw that program.
You saw that program,
I saw
right?
that program. It was just
They
incredible.
are stronger about their blackness than ever.
Absolutely, and it was just beautiful. It brought tears to my eyes to watch those people. Yes.
Children who are
Yes.
black now who go to integrated schools
Right.
are always in the danger of being brainwashed.
Yeah.
That couldn't happen in our
Yeah,
generation.
I know that. I know
Or
that in many ways integration has really messed us up. I remember, you see, all of the schools in Camden, New Jersey, which is where I actually grew
Right.
up across from Philadelphia, all the schools were segregated, at least at the elementary level. And we had black teachers, and those black teachers cared about us. I mean, they made us work. I mean, there was no laziness in our school, okay?
And don't you
Because
find it
those
interesting?
teachers
A lot of those teachers came out of normal schools.
Yeah, I know that.
You know?
I know, but
They
were,
did without
Yep.
this process that
Yeah.
they have at some of these educational institutes, and they were better teachers than
Well,
what I
I-
see today.
I think so. I think so. But we've lost a lot of that.
Well, we've lost a sense of ourselves.
Wow.
As Tom Wicker wrote in his book, racial integration in America is de facto. It's not a reality, but for a few, a select few. I heard a horrible story about that. He talks about this. Henry Louis Gates,
Yes.
a foremost black scholar at Harvard, lives in a town in Massachusetts where he went to the police
Yeah.
to let them know that he lived there so they would recognize his car. I wouldn't have done that.
And that when they saw him in this beautiful car,
Right.
they were not to assume that it had been stolen.
That's right. You know,
Of
and
course.
that's some of the stuff we've lost. For example, you couldn't have found a more outspoken advocate for civil rights or more eloquent than Bill Russell.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, with the advent of white agents and big money, these guys are no more than slaves.
It doesn't happen anymore.
Well, they're no more than slaves.
That's right.
They're just well-paid slaves.
There's a new plantation.
That's right.
There's a new plantation.
Huge plantation.
Oh, it's very
You know,
sad.
and since white colleges have found out that they can bring money in by going to the NCAA, I mean, you know that. I was in a new example of this integration. I was in October. I was at the Basketball Hall of Fame for a very good friend of mine from Philadelphia who's the head coach at Temple, men's basketball program, who has graduated 98% of his athletes.
Yeah, right.
John Chaney. And John talked about this. Now, John, the reason why John got a chance to play basketball and got to be this is Bethune-Cookman took him.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't going to take him at Temple
Right.
in Philadelphia
Right.
or St. Joe
Right.
or LaSalle
Right.
or Drexel. And so consequently, and you know, and there were some that slipped by. You were one of those that went to a white school, but they weren't a lot of you.
I went to a white school. You mean University of
Yeah,
Michigan?
right.
I can tell you stories about that.
I bet you can. Make me grow my hair back.
That's probably
Yeah,
true.
yeah. And,
Jeez. That's why I can't send them any money today.
well, how I
I'm
got to
serious.
where I am is that I went to school in the South. My dad sent me to a school in the South. And after moving from a milder segregation to a harsher
to a
form
harsh,
of
right, right.
segregation, I was looking at, her name is Ruby Dee and her husband,
Oh,
Ozzie
yeah,
Davis.
Sure, Ozzie, right.
And they
Ozzie.
asked, this guy was asking them, this was always a dumb question to me, why would you get right involved, how did you get involved in civil rights? And in those days, Sidney Poitier was involved in civil rights. Harry Belafonte, Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee. Like he said, what was I going to do? Sit around and just let it happen to us?
Right.
I mean, and that's the choices that we all had to make. I wasn't going to sit around and let it just happen to me. I had seen, at that time, the worst of what white America could be about. I remember going with my dad to school, getting to Washington, D.C., being taken off one car and put on the black car, which they called the colored car. One car on the train was for colored people.
Jim Crow car.
The Jim Crow car.
Yeah.
And the rest of the train half empty.
Right.
And us crowded in there standing up.
Right.
And that's why we had to take those box lunches, because we couldn't buy food on the train.
Right. Absolutely. that was an
That's when you
everyday-
had the shoebox with the chicken in it. You know, because you couldn't buy food.
That's all
on
I
the train.
knew in those days, John.
And see, the remarkable thing about this is that we grew, and my generation was a generation, of course we didn't like it. We were angry, but we did something about it. Our parents didn't let us become comfortable with the fact that we were going to be educated. The other thing is, my dad made it clear I was no better than any other black person that walked on the face of the earth, no matter what their status or earning power, no matter how education or the education they didn't have.
Right.
So why wouldn't I do this work?
Well, you bring up a very interesting point, and I don't want to sidetrack us from exposing you to your public. On the other hand,
Expose me.
On the other hand, let's go back to the Washington, because this bothers me even today, and that is that when you got off of those trains in Washington,
You
D.C.,
couldn't get a cab.
Now remember, this is the nation's capital.
That's right, you couldn't get a
When
cab.
you got off those trains, you could not get a cab because black people were not allowed to ride in white cabs, and black cabs were not allowed to pull up to the station.
They'd park 2 blocks away from the
That
station.
is correct. So you had to go running out there and try to flag one down, you see.
And how I knew that about Washington was the Howard Lincoln game used to be the big game in Philadelphia, the football game.
Right.
And I remember going with my dad, and my godfather went to Morehouse. So
Right.
there was all this, and I remember we had the bags, and we're going to go down and see an aunt of mine that lived in D.C., and my dad said, well, we got to go 2 blocks. And I'm, as a kid, I'm saying, well, why everybody else is getting a cab?
Right.
My father said,
That's right.
And
And that was a given. I mean, that's just the way it was. Now, what bothers me about this is that, well, let's take the Holocaust, for example. There is a great movement in this country to remember it, and indeed we should.
Absolutely.
We should never allow that mistake to happen again. However, let's talk about our history in this country.
there's 2 people,
We don't want to remember that.
Native Americans, who they put on reservations so they don't even have to think about them,
Right.
who they completely wiped out or tried to, and they don't want to talk about them.
Right.
Now, recently I saw Middle Passage. Well, HBO produced Middle
Right.
Passage. And Derek Bell makes that point in his book,
Absolutely. And
that
well.
there's a direct connection between slavery, Middle Passage, and what's going on today.
Right.
Because that's when racism occurred, and occurred for the first time, and was instituted as the institution we're still dealing with. That institution was put in place then, and black and white alike, we were born into that institution, into this country. And that institution has been carried out sometimes in a brutal, and now in more subtle ways, and still brutal.
Well, let's talk about the more subtle ways, because let's bring it into the future. I mean into the present.
I would like to say that it's more subtle, but when I saw Middle Passage, the first thing I thought of, that kind of brutality, is James King. You know who James King is? In Texas.
Of course I know.
Dragged behind a car alive. That mentality, even though they may not represent the majority of America, still out there. So when you can exhibit that kind of savagery, it's carried over 400 years, right from Middle Passage, right down to Texas and James King. And there were no marches in America about James King. And now they want to wipe that out. Well, we caught them. But what was the institution that made it possible for these two men to enact that kind of savagery and barbarism on another human being?
And what is the institution which still
Racism.
allows it? Okay. Let's then, because our time is going to run out, let's talk about your involvement right now and what it has been for the past few years in the Racial Justice and Equity Project. I mean, these are modern times. You live in Vermont. We don't have those kind of problems here, do we? I'm sorry to ask it that.
I don't know. Be a child in some remote community, a child of color in some remote community. You were on the Human Rights Commission, and watch, and this child is beaten, called nigger, or some other words, and watch principals, guidance counselors, police people in this rural town all band together to defeat this child and make that child the problem as opposed to the problem that these other children exhibit when they do this. And this goes on today. Got something similar to that going on right now. And it's like it doesn't happen. They lie. You know, they'll go as far. I mean, I've seen kids 7 and 8 years old be labeled sexual perverts at 7 and 8.
Yeah.
Because once they pull the little girl's dress up. And that record followed them from one school to another. In another community, 12 children of color, all 12 were in special ed. You remember that.
Oh, of course I remember.
See, I don't need then to have a roadmap. You don't need to be Einstein to understand that if children are doing this to other children, schools weren't teaching them how to do this. So where did it come from? From their homes and the communities they grew up with. So, I mean, I know that whatever my children engaged in, if I gave them license to do that, that's what they would do. And you know that too, raising a family. So I have to think that there's an element in Vermont that's very strong and very pervasive that allows this to occur. So consequently, this then filters out down in other places. Unfair treatment on jobs, lack of opportunity.
A biased criminal justice system.
Oh, God, totally out of whack. Some of the highest percentages per populations and per capita in the country. And interesting, I mean, I kind of just fell into this because Richard Wright, who was here and started the project, I started helping him, and I've been doing that ever since. I mean,
this is a racial justice and equity group.
Right, and I'm also in the fortunate position of not having to pay for my children's education any longer. My 3 children are finished.
Right.
And they're in a position to take care of themselves. They're all 3 college graduates. So, heck, I'm here. And one of the things, if you're semi-retired, is that will kill you quicker than anything else is retirement.
So what does your project do? I mean, what's the operation?
The operation is that we do what any other kind of, I mean, we become an advocate, become a spokesperson. Because if you're a young black person or a person who's raising a family and everything, you've got to live in the society as a whole. There is no way that black people can work for institutions and say all the things that they need to say. They need to work. They need to keep quiet about certain things. That's part of the price they pay. You know that's true. There's not one institution in Vermont where a black person could be as outspoken as I am and not feel the weight of it. It'll cost them promotions. It'll cost them raises. It does anyway a lot of times.
Yes.
Their children. I mean, so they got to pay for food on the table. They got to pay rent or buy a mortgage. So consequently, I'm in a unique position, you and I, at this time in our life, where we can say what we choose to say. We can tell the truth like it is. And we're looked on as the scourges of the earth.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting to me.
And get hate mail and
Get hate
calls.
mail.
Yeah, I know.
Calls at home.
That's the way it goes.
I mean, I remember one call I got in particular at the Racial Justice and Equity Project, and I came in there